"You're late," Tracy said, smirking as she sat on the edge of the bed, her legs crossed. "Traffic was a nightmare," Dan replied, tossing his jacket onto the chair by the window. He leaned down, kissing her lightly on the lips, his hand resting on her knee. "But I'm here now, aren't I?" Tracy tilted her head slightly, running her fingers through his hair. "And I'm glad you are," she whispered, glancing at the clock. "But we're still waiting for Jake." "He'll be here," Dan assured her, his tone casual as he settled beside her. He wouldn't miss this for the world. Tracy's heart raced, her excitement barely contained. This wasn't their first rendezvous, but tonight felt different. She could feel it in the air, a tension that hung heavy, stirring something deep within her. She pushed the thought aside as Dan's hand began to slide up her thigh, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver through her. She leaned into him, their lips meeting again, this time with more intensity. A soft creak interrupted them, the door slowly opening. Tracy pulled back, turning her head as Jake stepped inside, his eyes locking onto hers with a familiar hunger. "Hope I'm not too late for the wild party," he said, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "Just in time," Tracy replied, her voice smooth, as she rose from the bed to greet him. She moved toward him, her hand reaching out to touch his chest before pulling him into a deep kiss. Their bodies pressed together, the anticipation between them building with every passing second. Dan watched them, his gaze intense, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Why don't we get started?" he suggested, his voice low, almost a growl. Tracy glanced back at him, her lips still close to Jake's ear. She grinned, feeling the familiar rush of excitement that always came when the three of them were together. Without another word, they began to undress, each piece of clothing discarded with a sense of urgency. Jake reached for the buttons on Tracy's blouse, his fingers working quickly to undo them. Dan was already pulling off his shirt, tossing it aside before stepping closer to help Jake with Tracy's skirt. She stood still, letting them undress her, their hands moving over her body with practiced ease. As the last piece of clothing fell to the floor, Tracy stepped back toward the bed, her eyes never leaving the two men in front of her. Dan and Jake exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them before they moved to join her. The room was filled with the sound of rustling sheets and soft, urgent whispers as they climbed onto the bed. Tracy felt the familiar weight of Dan's body pressing against hers, his hands exploring every inch of her skin. Jake was behind her, his breath hot against her neck as he kissed a trail down her spine. For a while, there was only the three of them, lost in the moment. The world outside the hotel room ceased to exist, leaving only the shared intimacy that they had come to crave. Tracy closed her eyes, letting herself be consumed by the sensations, by the feeling of being with two men who knew exactly how to touch her, how to make her feel alive. She could hear their breaths mingling with hers, their voices whispering her name, each sound sending a thrill through her. Jake's hand slid down her back, his fingers tracing a path to her waist, pulling her closer. Dan's lips found her neck, kissing her softly before biting down just enough to make her gasp. Tracy responded with a low moan, her body arching between them, caught in the intense connection they shared. Time seemed to stretch, each moment blending into the next as they moved together, their desires intertwining. There was no rush, no hurry to reach the climax. It was the journey, the shared experience, that they savored most. Dan shifted, turning Tracy onto her back, his eyes locked onto hers as he leaned down to kiss her deeply. Jake moved beside them, his hand sliding up Tracy's thigh, fingers brushing against her skin with a deliberate slowness that made her shiver. The three of them continued, their movements deliberate, each one adding to the growing tension that built between them. Tracy felt herself edging closer, her breath quickening, heart pounding in sync with the rhythm they set. Hours passed, the clock ticking unnoticed on the wall as the room echoed with sounds of pleasure. Tracy, Dan, and Jake moved together in a rhythm they knew well, their laughter mingling with moans and soft whispers urging each other on. The intensity between them built with every passing moment, each touch and kiss fueling the fire that burned in the room. Jake kissed Tracy's neck, his breath warm against her skin. "You're incredible," he murmured, his hands roaming freely over her body. He traced a path from her shoulders down her back, feeling the heat of her skin against his fingertips. "I could stay like this forever." Dan, who was lying beside her, leaned in close, his breath tickling her ear. "Me too," he agreed, his voice low. "You're perfect, Tracy." His hand found its way to her waist, pulling her closer as he kissed her shoulder, the warmth of his lips leaving a trail on her skin. Tracy closed her eyes, letting their words wash over her. She felt like the center of the universe, their attention and affection enveloping her. But as she lay there, sandwiched between them, a nagging feeling started to creep into her thoughts. It was a faint unease, something that felt out of place, gnawing at the edge of her consciousness. Jake noticed the shift in her mood. "What's wrong?" he asked, lifting his head to look at her, his brow furrowed with concern. Tracy hesitated, forcing a smile to cover her unease. "Nothing," she lied, shaking her head. "I'm just overwhelmed." Dan, still close to her, chuckled softly. "In a good way, I hope," he teased, planting another kiss on her shoulder. His hand moved to her hip, drawing lazy circles on her skin. Tracy nodded, trying to push the feeling away. But it clung to her, growing stronger by the second. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, hoping a distraction would help clear her mind. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unlocked the screen. A notification popped up, a new message. She frowned, seeing that it was from Dan's phone. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the message. A photo filled the screen, one that shouldn't exist. It was of the three of them, tangled together in bed, caught in a moment of their shared passion. The caption below it sent a chill down her spine. "You're lucky with her. Look at this, she's good at serving two of us." Tracy's breath caught in her throat. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking as she thrust the phone toward Dan and Jake. Dan's face went pale as he took the phone from her, his eyes widening in disbelief. "I didn't send that," he said quickly, his voice edged with panic. He grabbed his own phone from the nightstand, frantically scrolling through it. "It's not from me." Jake leaned over, looking at the screen, confusion written across his face. "Someone hacked your phone?" he suggested, though his voice carried more doubt than certainty. Tracy's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, that's not possible," she muttered, trying to make sense of the situation. Panic began to rise in her, a tightness in her chest that made it hard to breathe. "Who did you send this to?" Dan's eyes were still glued to his phone, his fingers moving frantically as he checked his messages, his call logs, anything that might explain what was happening. Then, all at once, he froze, his face draining of color. He looked up at Tracy, his eyes wide with horror. "Your husband, Tony." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Tracy stared at Dan, her mind spinning, trying to process what he had just said. "Oh my God, Tony's going to kill me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake looked between them, his face a mixture of disbelief and fear. "What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly as the weight of the situation settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Dan nodded, still holding his phone, his mind racing. "We should go to the police," he suggested, though the fear in his eyes showed he wasn't sure if that was the right move. "And say what?" Jake countered, his voice rising in panic. "That we've been cheating, and now we're scared because her husband found out? What do you think they'll do?" Tracy ran her hands through her hair, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. "We have to do something," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "We can't just wait around for him to come after us." Dan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Maybe we can talk to him," he suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Explain what happened, try to calm him down." Jake shook his head. "You don't know Tony. He's not going to listen. He's going to want blood." Tracy felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, the fear and guilt overwhelming her. "This is all my fault," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I shouldn't have let this happen." Dan stepped closer, reaching out to take her hand. "It's not your fault," he said firmly, though his own fear was evident. We all made this choice. We just have to figure out what to do next. But even as he said the words, Tracy knew they were out of options. The door felt like a ticking time bomb, and they were all trapped, waiting for it to explode. The air in the room thick with tension. Tracy paced back and forth, her thoughts spiraling into a dark abyss of guilt and fear. Every few seconds, she'd glance at the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, his head buried in his hands, silent except for the occasional deep sigh. Dan leaned against the wall, his eyes glued to his phone, searching for answers that weren't there. "This can't be happening," Tracy muttered, her voice strained. She ran her hands through her hair, tugging at the ends as if the pain would somehow clear her mind. "He's going to find out. He's going to, oh God, what have I done?" Jake lifted his head, his face pale. "We should leave. Get out of here before he shows up." His voice was shaky, lacking conviction. "And go where?" Dan asked, his tone flat. "He knows where we live. He'll find us eventually." He put his phone down and rubbed his temples, trying to think. "We need to talk to him. Maybe we can calm him down, make him see reason." Tracy shook her head. "You don't know Tony. When he's angry, there's no talking to him." Her voice broke, and she bit her lip, trying to hold back the tears. "I don't know what to do." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the room, followed by a voice that sent a chill down Tracy's spine. "Open up." Tony's voice thundered from the other side of the door. "I know you're in there, Tracy." Tracy's blood ran cold, her heart stopping for a moment as she recognized the voice. It was Tony, her husband, and he wasn't alone. Tracy froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Tony," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Jake jumped up from the bed, his eyes darting between Tracy and the door. "What do we do?" he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. Dan pushed off the wall, moving toward the door. We have to let him in," he said, though his voice trembled. "If we don't, he'll just make a scene. We'll talk to him, explain that it's not what it looks like." But even as he spoke, Tracy knew there was no talking their way out of this. The evidence was too damning, and Tony wasn't the kind of man who would listen to explanations, especially not after what he'd seen. With trembling hands, Tracy reached for the door. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, before finally unlocking it. The door swung open with a force that made her stumble back, and Tony stormed in, his face a mask of rage. Behind him stood his friend Alan, whose expression was equally furious. "You cheating bitch!" Tony slapped her, his voice dripping with venom. His eyes bore into hers, and Tracy could see the betrayal, the hurt, the fury burning within them. "I trusted you." "Tony, please, let me explain," Tracy started. But her voice was cut off as Tony stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Explain?" Tony snarled, his fists clenched at his sides. "What is there to explain? I saw the picture, Tracy. I know what you've been doing behind my back." His voice rose with each word, his anger barely contained. Alan, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Dan and Jake. "You two assholes think you can just mess around with another man's wife and get away with it?" Dan raised his hands in a placating gesture, his voice calm but laced with fear. "Look, we didn't mean for this to happen. We were just having fun. It wasn't supposed to be serious." "Fun?" Tony echoed, his tone cold and dangerous. "You think this is fun? Destroying my marriage? Making a fool out of me?" He took another step toward Dan, who backed away, his hands still raised in surrender. Jake, who had been standing frozen by the bed, finally found his voice. "Tony, we're sorry. We didn't mean to hurt you." He took a tentative step forward, his eyes pleading. "Let's just talk about this, okay?" But Tony wasn't listening. His face twisted with rage. Before anyone could react, Tony and Alan moved with a speed and determination that left no room for resistance. Alan seized Dan by the collar, dragging him off the bed and slamming him onto the floor. Dan struggled, but Alan had the upper hand, quickly forcing his arms behind his back. The sound of rope tightening filled the room, followed by the dull thud of Dan's body hitting the floor as Alan shoved him down. Tracy watched in horror as Tony grabbed her, his hands rough as he yanked her arms behind her back. "Tony, please," she cried out, her voice cracking with fear. "You don't have to do this." Tony ignored her, his grip tightening as he bound her wrists with a practiced efficiency. The ropes cut into her skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the terror coursing through her veins. She twisted in his grasp, trying to free herself, but it was no use. "You think you can just cheat and get away with it?" Tony hissed, his breath hot against her ear. "You're going to regret every single moment you spent with these two." Jake, who had been frozen in shock, finally tried to fight back. He lunged at Alan, but his effort was clumsy, driven more by panic than any real strategy. Alan easily overpowered him, grabbing him by the neck and forcing him to his knees. "Stay down," Alan growled, his voice low and menacing. He produced another length of rope, binding Jake's wrists and forcing a gag into his mouth. Jake's muffled protests were cut short as Alan tightened the gag, leaving him silenced and helpless. Tracy struggled against the ropes binding her wrists, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound in the room. "What are you doing?" she shouted, her voice rising in panic. "Tony, please, don't do this." Tony didn't respond. He was too focused on his phone, scrolling through it with a grim expression. After a moment, he looked up, his eyes meeting Tracy's. "You wanted to play games, Tracy," he said coldly. "Now we're going to play one of our own." Alan moved across the room, setting up a camera on the dresser. He adjusted it, making sure it was pointed directly at the bed. The lens seemed to stare at them, unblinking, a silent witness to the horror that was about to unfold. "We're going to make sure you never forget this night," Alan said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Tracy's blood ran cold as she realized what they were planning. "No, no, please, Tony, don't do this." She tried to pull away, but Tony's grip on her arm was ironclad. He forced her toward the bed, shoving her down onto the mattress. Tony leaned in close, his eyes boring into hers. "You wanted to put on a show, didn't you? Well, now you're going to perform for the world to see." Tracy's heart raced, her chest heaving as she gasped for breath. "Please, Tony," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Don't make us do this." But Tony's expression remained hard, unyielding. He turned to the camera, checking the angle one last time before pressing the record button. The red light blinked on, signaling the start of their nightmare. "Do it," Tony ordered, his voice harsh. He shoved her forward, forcing her to face Dan and Jake, who were both tied up and unable to move. "Do what you did with them before I walked in." Tracy's mind was a whirlwind of shame, fear, and despair. She looked at Dan and Jake, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. They were just as helpless as she was, caught in a situation that none of them had ever imagined. Tears blurred her vision as she realized the horror of what was about to happen. She had no choice but to comply, knowing that any resistance would only make things worse. Her body moved mechanically, going through the motions as Tony and Alan barked orders, their voices sharp and unforgiving. The next few hours were a blur of humiliation and terror. Tony and Alan forced them to perform for the camera, their cruel taunts and jeers filling the room. They reminded Tracy of the betrayal, of the pain she had caused, each word a knife twisting deeper into her heart. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but every time she tried, the ropes dug into her wrists, the gag muffling her cries. Dan and Jake were equally trapped, their eyes filled with shame and fear. They tried to protect her, to take the brunt of Tony and Alan's wrath, but there was little they could do. Every movement was dictated by their captors, every action a testament to the control Tony and Alan now wielded over them. As the night wore on, Tracy's mind began to shut down, retreating into a place where the pain and humiliation couldn't reach her. She couldn't believe this was happening, that the man she had once loved was now turning her worst nightmare into a reality. The camera continued to record, capturing every moment of their torment, every tear that fell, every broken plea that escaped their lips. Tracy lay there, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. The nightmare had only just begun, and she knew that the worst was yet to come. The first rays of the sun filtered through the curtains as Tony and Alan finished their cruel game. The night had been long, and the silence in the room was only broken by the sound of labored breathing. Tony, holding the camera that had captured everything, looked down at the three broken figures on the bed. "You're all disgusting," he spat, his voice laced with contempt. He glanced at Tracy, her body still bound by the weight of shame. "This is going to ruin you, Tracy. Your reputation, your career, everything. And I'll make sure everyone sees it." Tracy didn't respond. Her body was too numb, her mind too shattered to muster even a word of defiance. She lay there, eyes unfocused, as Tony and Alan walked out, slamming the door behind them with finality. For a long time, the room was quiet. Dan, Jake, and Tracy lay motionless, the events of the night leaving them too stunned to move or speak. Eventually, Dan stirred, his movements slow and deliberate as he pulled himself up from the bed. "We need to go," he murmured, his voice rough from the hours of tension and fear. He looked at Jake, who hadn't moved, his face buried in his hands. Jake shook his head. "Go where? It's over, man. Everything's ruined." His voice was hollow, devoid of the bravado that had once defined him. Tracy finally sat up, her body aching from the physical and emotional toll of the night. I have to get home," she whispered, though the word home felt like a lie. There was no going back to the life she had known. "I have to figure out what to do next." Dan nodded, but there was no conviction in his agreement. They all knew that the consequences of the night weren't confined to this room. The world outside was waiting, ready to tear them apart once Tony unleashed his revenge. By the time it was over, Tracy was a shell of the person she had been. Tony and Alan finally untied them, leaving them bruised, broken, and shattered. They left without another word, taking the camera with them, leaving the room in a deafening silence. The three of them dressed in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on them. Tracy's hands trembled as she fumbled with her clothes, her mind racing with thoughts of what awaited her. What had Tony done with the video? Who would he send it to first? Her boss? Her friends? Her parents? As they left the hotel room, the first rays of the sun had fully risen, bathing the parking lot in an unforgiving light. The normalcy of the morning felt like a cruel joke, a stark contrast to the nightmare they had just lived through. Fallout and desperation, Tracy returned home, the walk to her front door feeling like a death march. Inside, the house was still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the storm that was about to descend. She locked the door behind her, leaning against it for support as her legs threatened to give out beneath her. In the silence of her empty home, the reality of her situation crashed down on her. Tony's threats echoed in her mind, the memory of his sneer searing into her thoughts. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a text from Tony. "Check your email," it read. With trembling hands, she opened her laptop and logged into her email. There, at the top of her inbox, was a message from Tony. She clicked on it, her heart pounding. The email was brief, containing only a video file and a single line of text. "This is just the beginning." Tracy's stomach churned as she realized what it was. She didn't need to watch the video to know what it contained. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to open it or delete it, as if doing either would change what was already set in motion. Over the next few days, Tony made good on his threats. The video was sent to her workplace, to her friends, to her family. Each time, the fallout was immediate and devastating. Her boss called her in for a meeting, his expression grim as he handed her a termination letter. "This isn't something we can overlook, Tracy. I'm sorry." Her friends, those who had once stood by her through thick and thin, began to distance themselves, their messages becoming cold and infrequent. Her parents, horrified and ashamed, couldn't even look at her when she finally gathered the courage to visit them. "What have you done?" her mother asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "How could you let this happen?" Tracy tried to explain, to justify her actions, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand herself? How had her life spiraled so far out of control? Jake and Dan faced their own consequences. The video spread online, going viral within days. Their names, their faces were plastered all over social media, the subject of ridicule and scorn. Jake's girlfriend left him, unable to cope with the public humiliation. Dan's business suffered, his clients fleeing as his reputation crumbled. In their shared misery, the three of them became even more isolated. They avoided each other, the sight of one another only serving as a reminder of the hell they were now living in. Tracy, desperate to salvage what little remained of her life, tried to confront Tony. She found him at their old apartment, the place they had once shared before everything had gone wrong. "Tony, please," she begged as he opened the door, his expression cold and unyielding. "You've made your point. Please, stop this. I'll do anything." Tony's eyes flickered with something dark, something that sent a chill down Tracy's spine. "Anything?" he repeated, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Tracy nodded, her throat tight with fear and desperation. "Yes, anything." Tony stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "We'll see about that," he said, closing the door behind her with a finality that made Tracy's heart sink. She realized, too late, that the nightmare was far from over. Tracy sat in the dimly lit room, a bottle of whiskey clutched in her hand. The walls seemed to close in on her, the weight of what had happened pressing down like a physical force. She had lost everything, her job, her friends, her family's respect, and the video was still out there, a ticking time bomb waiting to destroy whatever remained of her life. She took another swig from the bottle, feeling the burn of the alcohol as it slid down her throat. It didn't numb the pain, but it was the only thing that kept the screaming in her head at bay. Days blurred together, each one marked by a growing sense of dread. She barely left the house, too afraid of the judgmental stares and whispers that followed her everywhere she went. Her phone, once a source of connection, now only delivered more bad news, more people who had seen the video, more bridges burned. The shame was unbearable. She avoided mirrors, unable to face the woman she had become. Late one night, as she lay on the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling, her phone buzzed. She ignored it at first, assuming it was just another notification about the video, but the buzzing continued, persistent. With a sigh, she picked it up, squinting at the screen. It was a message from Jake. "We need to talk. I'm so sorry. Please, let me help." Tracy stared at the words, her mind sluggish from the alcohol. She hadn't spoken to Jake or Dan since that night in the hotel room. She had assumed they were both trying to move on, distancing themselves from the disaster they had helped create. But now, seeing Jake's message, something inside her stirred, a flicker of hope or maybe just the desperate need to not feel so alone. She hesitated for a moment before typing a reply. "Okay. When?" "Now," Jake responded almost immediately. "I'm outside." Tracy dragged herself to the window and peered outside. Sure enough, there was Jake, leaning against his car, looking as haggard as she felt. She let out a long breath and went to the door, unlocking it with shaky hands. Jake stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the mess and the empty bottles scattered around. "Tracy, you look," he trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence without making things worse. "I know," Tracy said flatly, crossing her arms over her chest. "You don't have to say it. I'm a mess." Jake shook his head. "No, that's not what I meant. I'm sorry, Tracy. I never thought things would go this far." Tracy dropped onto the couch, feeling the weight of his words. "None of us did. But that doesn't change anything, does it? My life is over, Jake." Tony made sure of that. Jake sat down beside her, his expression grim. "It's not over. Not yet. I've been thinking. There has to be a way to fight back. We can't just let him win." Tracy laughed bitterly. "Fight back? With what? He's got everything. The video, the power to destroy us whenever he wants. We don't stand a chance." Jake leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We do, Tracy. We know what he did to us. We know what kind of person he is. If we can prove it, if we can gather enough evidence, we can turn this around. We can make him pay." The idea seemed absurd, a pipe dream born out of desperation. But as Tracy looked into Jake's eyes, she saw something she hadn't felt in a long time: determination. For a moment, the fog of despair lifted, and she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do we fight back against someone like Tony?" Jake hesitated, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small notebook. "I've been doing some research, talking to people. We need to gather evidence, texts, emails, anything that proves what he did to us. And we need to find a way to get him to admit it, or at least get something on record." Tracy stared at the notebook, her mind racing. It was a long shot, a risky plan that could backfire in a million different ways. But what choice did she have? Her life was already in ruins. She had nothing left to lose. Before she could respond, there was a knock on the door. Tracy's heart skipped a beat, panic flaring. Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. "It's Dan," came the reply, muffled through the door. "Jake called me. Can I come in?" Tracy exchanged a glance with Jake, who nodded. She got up and opened the door, letting Dan in. He looked as exhausted as she felt, dark circles under his eyes and his clothes rumpled as if he hadn't slept in days. "I'm sorry, Tracy," Dan said, his voice thick with guilt. "For everything. I know I messed up, but I want to help. We need to stick together if we're going to get through this." Tracy sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We're really doing this, aren't we? Going after Tony?" Jake nodded. "We are. It's the only way." Tracy looked at the two men in front of her, the last people she ever thought she'd be relying on. But in this twisted situation, they were all she had left. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's do it. Let's take him down." With that, the three of them sat down to plot their next move, unaware of the dangerous path they were about to tread. They knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be risks, confrontations, and moments when it would seem impossible. But they were driven by desperation, anger, and the burning need for justice. As the night wore on, they hatched a plan, going over every detail, every possible outcome. It was a dangerous game, but they were determined to win. And as they plotted their revenge, the bonds between them began to strengthen, forged in the fires of shared suffering. By the time they finished, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light into the room. They were exhausted but resolute, ready to take the first steps in their fight against Tony. "We'll meet tomorrow," Jake said, standing up and stretching. "We've got a lot of work to do." Tracy nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in what felt like forever. "Yeah, tomorrow." As they left, Tracy stood by the window, watching them drive away. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but for the first time, she felt like she had a chance. Tony had taken everything from her, but she wasn't going to let him win, not without a fight. And as she turned away from the window, a steely resolve settled in her chest. Tony had started this war, but she was going to finish it,